So good to see so many of you today. We invite you to turn to Nehemiah chapter 2, this book of the Old Testament. As I mentioned to you, we're in a message series called Restore. We're talking about God calling us to meet needs in the world primarily, and how through that calling He develops us and changes us. The first week, you'll see some of the words up here on Nehemiah's wall. These are the actual bricks. Just kidding. You see these words up here. They represent what we've been talking about through our message series. In the first week, we talked about calling, how God brought news to Nehemiah about the walls of Jerusalem and how he felt called to do something about it, and how then God used that call to develop his character, that before God could do something through him, God was going to do something in him. And that was a powerful, powerful work of character to prepare him for the calling that God had in mind. Then last week, we spoke about faith. And we talked about the faith that is attendant to the calling of God in our lives. And how God is wanting to build our faith through it. And how it must take faith in order to trust God for the resources necessary for us to fulfill the calling of God, that we don't do this in and of ourselves, that it is God who provides the resources. And we saw this in Nehemiah chapter 2, in the beginning of chapter 2, when the king gave resources to Nehemiah. He gave him permission to go to the other land. He gave him passage, safe passage. He gave him timber. He also gave him an army. And this was a supernatural act of God. I mean, God had moved in the heart of this king of Persia to allow Nehemiah to go back and to restore Jerusalem. So we're in 444 BC. Nehemiah is serving for the king of Persia. He's a cupbearer, the Bible says, a wine taster. He's been given this permission to go back and to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, because this was so important to their faith, to the Jewish faith, because as the walls went, so did the faith of Israel. And so we're going to pick up here in chapter 2, beginning in verse 11. But I want to remind you today that as God calls us, He is about changing us. It's not simply doing something for God on His behalf. But He has a unique person in mind to meet a specific need. And that inherently means that we must be able to see the needs around us. And so today we're going to talk about vision. And here's the million-dollar question for you today. What do you see? What do you see? Not what do you look at? What do you see? Vision is a part of the calling of God, because as God calls us, we must begin to see the world as He sees the world. Which inherently means this: when God calls you, we really see three things differently. And we learned this from chapter 1 in the prayer of Nehemiah. First of all, we begin to see God differently. We see God differently. Nehemiah, though he had faith for many, many years, Nehemiah now was able to see God in a different light. And he saw now a God who was able, a God who was desirous to do something in the world. Not that God was just transcendent, He was up there in heaven, but that God really wanted to meet some real needs. And Nehemiah's heart was burdened for that. He began to see God differently, as God was wanting to and able to do something miraculous in this world. So he saw God differently. He also began to see himself differently. Begin to see himself differently. We read in that prayer where he had talked about his own sin and he had confessed his sin to God. But then he called himself a servant of God. And so here's Nehemiah. He's a cupbearer to the king of Persia. He's working in the king's court. And he's certainly a servant of this earthly king. But Nehemiah began to see himself differently. He saw himself now as a servant of the one true king. That he was now responsible to an audience of one. And that meant ultimately, no matter who was above him, no matter who was in authority over him, that he would need to serve the ultimate king of the universe and please him. And so he began to see himself differently in light of the king that he served. Not only that, he began to see the world differently. He began to see the world differently. He looked around, and not only did he look, but he saw. And we're going to talk about the difference between those two things. Nehemiah began to have vision. vision. He began to have an idea of the future that God wanted. And he began to feel that God wanted to use him to accomplish that future. And I'm here to say to you that that is true for each and every one of us, that God has a preferable future in mind for you, for your family, for the world around you. And he wants to use you to restore it. He wants to use you to accomplish it. God is always about the future from the standpoint of change and from the standpoint of accomplishing his ideal purposes on this earth. And that's the wonderful, wonderful, wonderful thing about God, is that he forgives our past and redeems our past. And Nehemiah had years and years and years of a past that was void of God's presence and God's power. But now a day arrived where he was looking to the future. So I want to explain for you today what vision means. Let's read in Nehemiah chapter 2, beginning in verse 11. This is what Nehemiah says. Now, this is after he had prayed, after he had felt the calling of God, after he had already gone before the king to ask for permission to go back to Jerusalem. And so he says this in verse 11, I went to Jerusalem. Now, we'll stop there for a second. Jerusalem was 800 miles away from Susa, a long, long way away. And it would take Nehemiah at least 2 months to travel from Susa to Jerusalem. We read 14 years earlier, when Ezra returned to Jerusalem, it took Ezra 4 to 5 months to make that journey. So this was a long, long way away. And Nehemiah was dreaming and he was thinking and he was planning about something that was distant. So he says, I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few men. Now, not for sure necessarily why it was the night that he went out to inspect the walls of Jerusalem. We get a little bit of a clue of it later on because Nehemiah felt this need to kind of keep things to himself. He was not announcing his purpose and his plan to the people who were there with him. So he went out at night, the Bible says, to inspect the walls with a few good men. And then he says this, I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. Well, Nehemiah was, I think, very wise in that. You know, God's calling upon our lives doesn't require immediate action. It requires us first to immediately act in prayer. It requires us first to immediately to look within. It requires us first to immediately inspect and research. And so as of yet, he had not shared with anyone. And this is amazing, given the fact that they had traveled for probably 2 or 3 months to get there. These guys are going, what? I wonder where we're going. I wonder what's going on. I wonder why we're traveling. He kept it to himself. There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. Verse 13, by night I went out through the valley gate toward the jackal well and the dung gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, and its gates, which had been destroyed by fire. Then I moved on toward the fountain gate and the king's pool. But there was not enough room for my mount to get through. In other words, the walls were in such disrepair he could not get through. So I went up the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally, I turned back and re-entered through the valley gate. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing because as of yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or nobles or officials or any others who would be doing the work. Then I said to them, you see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God upon me and what the king had said to me. They replied, let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. What is this you're doing, they asked. Are you rebelling against the king? I answered them, saying, the God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it. So, as Nehemiah rode around, he saw. And again, he didn't just look. There's a big difference between looking and seeing. Just as there's a big difference between hearing and listening. Right, guys? Big difference. One is about the physical properties of seeing and hearing. The other is about the use of the mind and the ponderance of the objects that are being viewed or being heard. So Nehemiah looked, but he also saw. And he saw two things. Let me share them with you today. He saw two things. Vision means this. It means, first of all, seeing what is. Seeing what is. Look in verse 17. After he had inspected the walls, he then said to them, "You see the trouble we're in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire." Nehemiah is just kind of being gut level honest with everybody. He looked upon the walls that were broken down. He looked upon the rubble. He looked upon the ruins. And God opened his eyes to the need. And Nehemiah, in his mind, connected the dots of the walls here of Jerusalem to the Jewish faith. And he saw, maybe even for the first time, he saw the need that God had called him to. Countless other people had probably ridden by the walls of Jerusalem. But now God had called someone to do something about it. You see, this story is so applicable to you and to me because we become so familiar with the broken down walls in our world. We become so familiar that we just kind of drive past them and ride past them. We don't see them. Countless people had saw it. But Nehemiah now saw the need behind it, which really goes to the point of leadership. Really goes to the point of leadership. See, leaders feel called to do something about what they see. Leaders are willing to step out and do something about needs of other people. And yet, in our lives, we drive by the broken down walls around us in the community. We become so familiar that we don't see them anymore. And I was thinking about that this week, and I wondered, why is that? Why is that? Why is it that we become so familiar with things in our world and the broken down nature of them that we just don't see them anymore for what they are? Well, I think there are a few reasons. First of all, I think our pain keeps us from seeing it. Our own pain. See, some of us have been hurt and wounded ourselves. Some of us have needs ourselves. And all we see in our world is us. We see our needs. We see what we lack. We see our broken down walls. We've been hurt. We have needs. And oftentimes, over time, what happens is that we only see us. We only see ourselves. You only see you. And God is wanting to broaden our horizons a little bit, to get us outside the selfish needs that we have. That's not to minimize the pain or the hurt, the wounds that you've gone through. But that's where many people stay in life. They stay in their brokenness. And they're never able to see beyond that. One of the things that I was most amazed at in the movie last night that we saw, and by the way, it was just a wonderful experience for us. I'll never forget it. This man who had experienced such tragedy in his life, who in time was able to see beyond himself to others and to see how God could use this tragedy in his life to minister to others' needs. Chuck Swindoll says that the church has got a really bad disease, a really bad case. He calls it ingrown eyeballitis. Ingrown eyeballitis. And boy, we become so myopic in our vision that all we see is ourselves and our own selfish needs. I heard a story this week about a man who had an ingrown toenail. And those of you who've ever had those, they're very painful from what I hear. And so his wife was going to help him with it. And you can just kind of get this picture in your mind. She's digging away, and he's squirming and squealing. And all of a sudden he says, "Stop it!" He says, obviously you've never, ever had an ingrown toenail. And she says, well, obviously you've never given birth to a child. And she just keeps right on digging. We become so consumed about ourselves that we don't think about what other people have gone through. And I'm just here to say to you that pain in our own lives can keep us from a broader perspective about life and about God redeeming our pain and our wounds and our past and being able to use us in some way to minister to other people's needs. And it can limit our vision if we're not careful. Secondly, fear. Fear. I think fear often keeps us from the vision that God has for us. It keeps us from the ability to see. Because our mind works like this. Well, if I see it, I'll have to do something about it. So maybe I'll just change the channel. Or maybe I'll just look away. How many of you have seen the ABC TV show, What Would You Do? How many of you have ever seen that show? Isn't that an interesting show? It's all these scenarios about people who have these situations and these struggles, and the whole idea of the show is built around the idea of what would total strangers do to people who are in need. And so somebody sent me a link not long ago to one of the videos with respect to it, and there was a lady who was an actor, and she passed out on the sidewalk in a busy city street. And it was amazing how many people just walked right past her. Walked around her to not help her to do anything. Well, oftentimes we're like that. We walk around, we go to the other side, we flip the channel for fear that we might have to do something. The other thing that keeps us, I think, from seeing is a sense of inadequacy. We feel inadequate to meet the need. It's such a huge need. It's such a big problem. We say to ourselves, how could I do anything about it? Well, the truth is, if it is just up to you, then you are inadequate. I am inadequate. But me plus God make a majority. And this is what Nehemiah realized. That the resources were infinite for him. That the ability to see something good happen out of the rubble and the ruins of his life is possible not because of his own resources, because in his own self he is limited. But with God, who had called him to this work, there is the possibility of divine intervention that would make the difference. You see, God is the X factor. And what God is calling you to, and as you see and you look and you sense, man, this thing is huge. I could never. God is there, and He is calling you, and He is the one who provides the resources to see it come to pass. So our pain, our fear, our inadequacy, these things can keep us from seeing. Do you remember the spies that went into the promised land? Remember Numbers 13? They felt pretty inadequate, didn't they? They went in to inspect the land before they were going to cross over into it and conquer it. These 12 spies went into the land to see what was in the land and to see their opponents and to see their adversaries and to see what challenges they would have. All 12 of these spies came back. How many of them said, no way, this cannot be done? How many of them said it? 10, yeah. It was 10. Only 2 said, we've got God. We can do this. The 10 said, we're like grasshoppers in their eyes. The 10 were like, hey, you know what? They're too big to miss. We can conquer. God is on our side. And so, in this situation, a majority is not always right when we view it from the standpoint of sheer numbers of men. 2 men, Joshua and Caleb, plus God, equaled the majority. And they would find the resources through their faith. You are only as big as your faith. The challenges are only as big as your faith to conquer those challenges. But you see, it's all about the way that you see things. It's about what you see. Which leads me to the second aspect of vision. The second characteristic of vision is this. It's not only seeing what is, but it's seeing what can be. This is indispensable. If you're going to truly understand vision, if you're going to understand the future that God has for you, you must have both of these things in your heart and in your mind. Because vision is not solely about what things are. Vision is about what things can be in the future. Certainly, seeing what is important. Current reality, we've got to fess up. We've got to be honest. We've got to evaluate. We've got to be gut-level honest with ourselves and others. This is the situation. But it's not just seeing what is, it's seeing what can be. You know, I've learned that there are a lot of people who can point out problems. They're kind of on that seeing what is side of the equation. They're kind of on the problem side of life. Their spiritual gift is a unique sense of the obvious. Well, this is the way things are. I know. We need to get on the solution side of life, folks. That doesn't mean minimizing what is. That doesn't mean not being honest about current reality. But this is where our faith comes into play. It's what we believe, it's what we see, and based upon that, what we will do. Nehemiah did not stay at the problem. He saw what is, but as he rode around that night, he began to have a vision of what could be, and that marks the difference in people of faith and character and trust in God between those that are not. Is what can God do with this mess? What can God... I know the way things are. But in God, this is the way things can be. Look at what he says in verse 17. He says, "Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace." He pointed out to them, look, Jerusalem lies in ruins. Look at the disgrace we're in. Look at our problems. And then right after that, come, let us rebuild this wall, and we will no longer be in disgrace. And then look in verse 20. When these three enemies, these three opponents come to him and say, what are you doing? Who do you think you are? And by the way, I wish I could say to you that calling, that vision, that God's future for you will always be free of opponents. But you will have the Sanballats and the Tobiahs and the Geshems in your life. You will always have them when you pursue God's calling. There will always be people who will be against it. But you are responsible to an audience of one. And Nehemiah said this. He said, listen, to those guys, the God of heaven will give us success today. And you have no right in this. It reminds me of the words that Ezra said when some people came along, some of these same folks, enemies on all sides, came along and said, what are you doing? Hey, and by the way, let us help you. And Ezra said, you have no right. You have no claim. This is God's work. You're opposing this. Get out of our way. Watch our smoke. We're moving forward because God is on our sides. Folks, again, we need to learn to live on the solution side of life. Vision may begin, it may be birthed in something that is negative. There are needs in this world. There are needs in your world. There are needs in your life. Those are real. But vision means moving past those real needs and seeing something greater that God can do. It never stays with the negative. It always results in a positive. Because vision is where God meets the earth. Vision is where heaven meets the needs of the earth. Vision is where God's will and our needs intersect. Where He is able to do something in this world that is real about real needs. And there's nothing like getting in on God's calling and His vision for the future. Nothing like it. This is what vision is. And I've got a little diagram here for you. Vision is the contrast between current reality, what is, and God's ideal, what can be. When you contrast those two things and you look at those two things squarely, what gives birth out of that is vision. is a preferable future that God has in store for you and for me. I want to challenge you this week. I want to challenge you this day to go from this place, and as you're driving by and as you're walking by, as you look at things, you will not just look, but you'll see. I want to encourage you as you drive into your neighborhood this afternoon after church is over, that you look at the homes and the houses around you, and you ponder for a moment the lives of real people who live in those houses. I want you to think about that person at the grocery store where you check out. She scans your groceries. I want you to look at her. I want you to see her as an object of God's love, who has a story of some kind in her life and who has needs that possibly God could use you to meet. To the bank teller, to the person who cuts your hair, that you would open your eyes to see spiritually the same things that God sees. I tell you, when we planted our church here, when we bought this piece of land, we, for the first time, we were kind of nomadic. I mean, we started in our home, and we went to an elementary school. We were there for a few years, and we were packing and unpacking and all that kind of stuff. And then we were in this temporary retail space that we were leasing for many years before purchasing this land and coming out this way. And there was a homecoming of sorts, at least in my heart. And the theme for our building campaign was building a home for hope. Because finally, real people finding real hope in the real world was going to have a home, a permanent home. And so I began to see things a little differently at that point, because no longer were we kind of traveling in tents anymore. We were finding a place. We were finding a home. And I remember real early on just driving around and thinking to myself, this is our mission field. This is where God has us. And if you were there in those early days, you heard me talk about that and how we needed to be missionaries in this community, and we needed to reach out to the school that was right down the street from us. And we're doing that and have done that. To the neighbors in the neighborhood. And some of you went with us those first days when, remember Linda, when we went over and we passed out water in this neighborhood. And 2 families now attend our church just from us passing out water bottles and setting it on the front porch of these homes. Every other Friday I take a plate of cookies from some wonderful women in our church who bake some cookies, and they bring them up to the church office, and I take them to these businesses. And I walk in and I say, we're from the Brook Church. We're right back here by you, and we just want to be a good neighbor. And we want to pray for you. And we hand them a plate of cookies, and they are awestruck. Literally, they're like, what strings are attached here? You know, do I need to give you some coupons or something? I said, no, we don't want anything. We just want to be good neighbors. And so I pray for these businesses and these people that I meet. And so God has just helped me to see a little bit better nowadays. Now, what about you? There are people in your world who have broken down walls. Can you get outside your own pain? Can you get outside your own fear? Can you get outside your own sense of inadequacy to say, God, I will be used. If you'll put something together, I will act. I will do what you want. I'll step forward in faith, in courage, just like Nehemiah, trusting you, God, for the outcomes. So I began the sermon today with the question, what do you see? What do you see? And I'm reminded of Jesus in Luke chapter 7. In Luke chapter 7, you remember I preached about this passage a few weeks ago when Simon the Pharisee invited Jesus to come over to his house for dinner. And the sinful woman came, and She poured out her heart before Christ there at that awkward moment in that formal dinner when everybody was prim and proper, and she just fell on the floor and cried and gave her heart to the Lord. Jesus, in that passage, after Simon the Pharisee kind of criticizes what happened, he says, if you knew what kind of woman she was. What I'm interested in is how Simon knew what kind of woman she was. He said, if you knew what kind of woman she was, you would know that she's a sinner. You know what Jesus does? He stands the woman up. And he says to Simon this, Simon, do you see this woman? He didn't see her. He looked at her. Do you see this woman? Would you open up your selfish eyes to see something in the world that is in need? A woman who is brokenhearted. And you are so prim and proper and religious that you can't see what is right before your very eyes. And I wonder how many times Mike Ayers has passed by because I was just too busy and it was just too inconvenient to see. In 1999, a movie came out. It's called At First Sight. At First Sight. Some of you probably remember it. Some of you women probably remember it. It's got Brad Pitt, heartthrob, Brad Pitt in the movie. He portrays the real life of a guy named Virgil Adamson. Virgil Adamson was blind since early childhood. And at the urging of his fiancée, he decides to have a surgery that might correct his sight. And he has this surgery, and guess what? The surgery works for a while. For a while, he's able to see clearly. But see, Virgil's mind had been conditioned to not see. Years and years and years of not being able to see had trained his mind and conditioned his mind in such a way that though his eyes worked fine, his mind could not see. And what happened over time is that Virgil's sight slowly went away. He could not judge distances. He could not judge light and shadow. And slowly he receded back into darkness. And it really confirmed what doctors and psychologists had thought all along, and that is this: we don't just see with our eyes, we see with our mind. We see with our mind. But many of us are conditioned not to. My encouragement to you today is begin to see with spiritual eyes. To see the way that God sees. When you do, a vision will be planted in your heart, and there'll be a hunger and thirst for others unlike any of you have ever experienced. And joy will be yours when you get your eyes off yourself and onto others. Let's pray.